Hi, I'm Scott Shearer, and welcome to Real World Flow presented for the Microsoft Flow Online Conference. First, a little about me. I'm a SharePoint and Office 365 evangelist and consultant with a special interest in Microsoft Flow. I live in Ashburn, Virginia, which is outside of Washington, D.C., and I've been around for a while, so I've done a lot of things, including everything from being a sysadmin and a developer to a CPA, a CFP, and a number of other things. Currently, I do a lot of training and mentoring of SharePoint SCAs, site owners, and do Office 365 consulting as well. My contact info, you can reach me at scott@o365scott.com. Please follow me on Twitter at ScottJShearer, and my YouTube channel. Titled I Didn't Know I Could Do That with Office 365. I believe I have 2 or 3 videos up there now on Office 365 and Flow topics, with much more to come. So my presentation today is based on the Flow community site. So let me switch over to the Flow community site now. If you want to get to the Flow community site, the easiest way is to go to powerusers.microsoft.com and go down to the bottom of the screen, and you'll see community sites for Power BI, Power Apps, and Flow. Click on the Flow link, and obviously that'll take you to the Flow community site. Alternatively, if you are in the Flow interface and scroll all the way to the bottom, you will see a link to the community site there as well. Now, the community site is a place to ask and answer questions. It is a fantastic resource for Flow knowledge. There are people all around the planet asking questions, and people all around the planet answering questions. So if you're looking for an answer on a Flow topic, my first stop would be to come and search the Flow community site to see if the question's already been asked. Also, I think the Flow community site is a great way to learn Flow. I will tell you that I learned more about Flow by monitoring the Flow community site, selecting questions to which I did not know the answer, finding the answer and posting it, than anything else I've done. It has been a great tool for me. I'm sure it'll be a great tool for you as well. One thing I do want to note on the community site is that Microsoft actually pays people to monitor the site and answer questions. It's almost like free paid support. So if you have a question and you post it on the community site, many times you will see that a Microsoft paid person will be answering your question. They don't answer all the questions. I come in a lot, and people all around the planet come around and answer questions, but I think that if you do post a question on the community site, the chances of you getting an answer are extremely high. It doesn't mean you're not going. It doesn't mean you'll get the answer you want, but you will get an answer to your question. So my session today is based on questions and answers that I've seen commonly on the Flow community site. I've selected a few, so let's walk through them one by one. One question I see frequently on the community site revolves around SharePoint lists and the ability to run a flow only when an item has changed. So you'll see a question like you see in front of you. I want my flow to run only when a SharePoint list item is changed. However, the flow runs also when a new item is created. So let's talk about that for a minute. Let me go over to Flow right now, and let me go to my flows and attempt to create a new flow. So when I go to create a flow from blank, I will search the connectors, or the triggers rather, go into SharePoint, and I can scroll up and down, but I am not going to see a trigger that says only fire this trigger when an item has changed. You will only see a trigger that will fire when an item is created or changed, but nothing when it is simply changed. So here, when an item is created or modified, when an item is created, but nothing that says when an item is modified. So let me do one more thing here. I'm going to go back to a SharePoint list and go to create a flow. So I'm going to say create a flow. And let's look at the templates. If I scroll down to the bottom of the templates, I say show more. There is a template here that says when an existing item is modified, complete a custom action. Oh, that sounds like what I want. So I'll select that template, and when it's done, I'll say continue, and I'll take a look at the trigger that has been selected. So it says when an existing item has been modified, but if I come over here, let's try this again, come over here and look at the information on it, you will notice that this is actually the same trigger. This will fire when an item is modified or it has been created. So selecting that template doesn't do you any good. It's still the same trigger. So this is what I wanted to get to. View operation description. Triggers when an item is created and also each time it's modified. So even though the template description says do something when an item is modified, and it will, but it also doesn't when it's created. So that doesn't do me much good. So the way around this is as follows. I've created a flow called check for change. And let's take a look at this flow. Now what I've done here is I've put a condition at the top of my flow. In a SharePoint list, you have a column with the date and time that an item was created. You also have a column that records the date and time that an item has been modified. So the way around the issue that we're discussing is to put a condition immediately following the trigger that compares the created time and the modified time. If they are the same, just kill the flow. And I'm using a control terminate action right here. And when I do that, by default, it says it goes to failed, but the flow hasn't failed. I just don't want to run it anymore. So I'm going to click succeeded, and the flow will stop at that point. If this is not the case, I'm going to drop down to, in this case, I'm sending an email, but whatever other actions you want. So, in review, there is no trigger at this time. There may be in the future, but currently there is no trigger that says, I only want to run this flow on a SharePoint list when an item is modified. So you have to work around it using a technique such as I am describing now. Hopefully at some point in the future we'll see a trigger that will only fire when an item is modified. Another common question I see on the Flow community site revolves around an individual's desire to send reminder emails to approvers, and this involves the Flow approval engine. So let's go over and take a look at a flow that I have created. So here you see it starts out in a pretty basic fashion. We are using the for a selected item trigger for a SharePoint list, so they'll manually kick off this flow. Now the technique that I'm showing you applies not only to SharePoint lists, but anywhere you are using the approval engine. But in this case, once again, we're using a SharePoint list. So we manually kick off the flow, and then we get more information on the SharePoint list, and pretty typically I am getting the manager of the individual that kicked off the flow. And here I am initializing a variable, and this is where we start to do something that's not standard for approvals. So this is a Boolean variable, and I initialize it to false. We are going to use this variable as an indicator of whether or not action has been taken on the approval request. It doesn't mean that the request has been approved or rejected. It simply means that action has been taken on the approval. It could be approved, it could be rejected. Not important for what we're doing here. The idea is that the approver has taken action. So let's take a look at the left side first. So we start the approval. Once the approval has completed, in other words, once action has been taken, we set the approval variable to true. Remember, we initialized it to false, and we are setting it to true, and I'm terminating the flow here. You don't have to. Maybe you're doing some other things. But the key to this is that after the approval action is complete, I change the value of this variable. Now, let's take a look at the parallel action over here. So when the flow starts and we initialize the variable, both the approval action and the block of actions we have over here are running in parallel. This particular group of actions is in a do until loop, and it will run until that variable is equal to true. In other words, it's going to run until action is taken on the approval. So when this starts, the first thing I do is delay. I sit and wait for a while, for a reasonable amount of time, and for test purposes, obviously, it's a bit shorter. I have that set to 1 minute for test purposes. After 1 minute is up, I then go into an if condition, if you will, and I check to see if the variable is still equal to false. In other words, no action has been taken. If that is the case, then I send an email to the approver as a reminder. I go back to the top of my loop, and it says it's going to run until the variable is equal to true. If it's not equal to true, I go down, I wait again, and the whole process continues, and will keep continuing until either the flow times out at 30 days or my approver takes action on the flow. So I'm using a parallel action here and a variable in order to send a reminder email out to an approver. Another common question I see revolves around the type of flow that we just ran, and that's using for a selected item trigger. So users will go in, they will create a flow using the for a selected item trigger, and tell their users that it's there, go run the flow for approvals or whatever other purposes the flow is for. The users will go in and they don't see the flow. So let's take a look at how you can have your users actually see and run the flows that you've been created for them, using the for a selected item trigger. So right now I'm in as another user, not myself, but another user, and I'm looking at the list that we were just using in our last example, where we kicked off an approval manually. So let's go ahead and try to do that. So I select an item here. I go up to the flow icon, and I don't see that available. However, if I come back to my alter ego, and I go to that list, I select an item, and come up here, I do see the approval reminder flow. So why is that? It has to do with permissions. So let's go take a look at that flow. That's my approval reminder flow. And if you notice down in the bottom right-hand corner, we have something called Manage Run Only Users. So the bottom line is this. I have to share this flow with my users in some way in order for them to see the flow available to them on that list. Now, I don't want to make everybody on the planet owners of the flow. That would give them access to my connection, the ability to edit the flow. Don't want that at all. All I want them to be able to do is run the flow. And that brings in the concept of a run-only user. I'm going to come down to Manage Run-Only Users and click on Add Another User. Now, I could add users manually, or in this case, I'm going to click on SharePoint, and what I'm going to do is share the flow with the list on a run-only basis. And by doing so, anyone with contribute access or higher permissions to that list will see that flow as being available to them. So let's go ahead and do this. So it wants to know what site, and I'm going to select the site, what list or library, my custom list. Now, connections used. I don't want to prompt the user for I don't want to have to prompt the user to supply a connection, and I may not want them to use their own connection. I want them to use the connection that I have selected when I created the flow. They won't be able to edit the flow or do anything with it, so it's safe to have them use my connection. So I'm going to say use this connection, use this connection, use this connection, and one more time, use this connection. All right, once I have all of those selected, I should be able to, let's come up here and click on Add, and it is done. So let me come, I will say Save, and bang, you can see that I have the custom list as a run-only user. So let me go back to my alter ego, and let me refresh the screen here, just because. Let me select an item, and when I click the down arrow now, if I give it a second, bang, there it is. I can see the approval reminder flow, whereas I could not see it before. So the takeaway here is that if you have a flow that for a SharePoint list or library that you want a user to manually kick off. In other words, it's using the for a selected item trigger. You need to share that flow in one way or another, and usually that means that you're going to share the flow as with the list or library as a run-only user. I've seen a lot of questions on the community site revolving around conditions, and typically it'll be something like this. I have a condition and it's always returning true, or I have a condition and it never returns true. One common cause of this type of ailment has to do with how Flow treats strings when it's doing the comparisons. So let's take a look at an example where we walk through the cause and the solution. This particular example actually comes from a customer that I was working with earlier today that had this exact problem, but it's typical of what I see on the community site. So in this case, when an item was created, they wanted to do an approval, and they wanted to say this. If they hard-coded the approver, and rather than looking for a manager, they had one particular individual approving all of these items. And they wanted that to be the case unless that individual had submitted an item. If that were the case, then they wanted someone else to approve it. So we have approver 1 approving everything unless he submits something, and in that case, someone else approves it. And what was happening was that we were comparing the email addresses. So let's take a look. So when an item is created, we initialize a variable, and here we have my name. And what they were doing was saying that if the approver if the individual who created the item, if their email address was equal to this variable, then go ahead and assign someone else. If it's not, then have that person be the approver. Pretty straightforward. What was happening was it never matched, and the reason it never matched was this. If you look up at my, I'm going to go to the top right-hand corner. Here's information on me, and notice my email. It's lowercase scott@shearerdemo.com. Now, nothing, so the bottom line here is that the string comparison here in my condition is case sensitive. So if I had this email address in all caps or all lowercase or anything other than exactly what you see here, it's not going to match. And when they initialized the variable, what they put in here did not match that person's email as it was in the system. So it never matched. So even though they submitted something, the approval came back to them. How do we fix that? So I'm using an expression, and I am converting everything to uppercase before I compare it. So the condition in this case, I'm whatever they put in for the approver, I am converting that to uppercase, and over here I am looking at the email of the individual that created the item, and I'm using an expression here that's to upper. I could have converted it to all uppercase, to all lowercase. This makes it so they don't have to worry about how they entered the email addresses here. So, pretty simple example, but it's also a pretty common source of frustration. So remember, if you are comparing characters, if you are comparing strings in a condition like you see here, remember that that string comparison is case sensitive. When I am doing something like that, I am always going to convert to either all uppercase or all lowercase, and in doing so, I'll save myself an awful lot of frustration. And the final example that I'd like to go through deals with deleting or moving files, actually. I've seen quite a few questions on the community site that say something like you see in front of you. I want to delete files older than X number of days in my SharePoint library. Or I want to move files after they have been in a location more than X number of days. Doing something to files in a library based on the a time lapse after 1 year, after 1 month, etc. And I've seen this question a lot, so I thought it would be worthwhile going through it here. So the example that I have here starts with a recurrence trigger. So for test purposes, I'm running this once a minute. In practice, you would run it once a day, once a week, once a month, something along those lines. And one thing that confuses people a lot with the recurrence trigger is the 30-day timeout rule for flows. The 30-day limitation has to do with the running of a particular instance of a flow. So once a flow starts running, it can only run for 30 days. A recurrence trigger is different. It's starting an instance of a flow based on a schedule. So don't think that when you use a recurrence trigger that it's only going to be good for 30 days. Is not the case at all. If you use a recurrence trigger, it can run it will run on that schedule for a very long time. Now, once again, starting with a recurrence trigger, we are running in our case once a minute. After that, we are getting information on files in a library. So I'm using the get files action that are going to retrieve all the files in a library. The next thing I do, and I'll explain why in a minute, is initialize a variable. It's a string variable, and I'm going to store date information in this variable. Here comes the good part. Now, once we retrieve the files, we are going to loop through them. Therefore, we are in an apply to each loop. So we're going to run this loop on every file that we got back from our get files action. The first thing I'm going to do is set that variable. And in my example, I have a date and time column in the list called compare date that I'm setting manually. In practice, you would normally use the modified date here or the created date, something along those lines. But to make it easy for test purposes, I have created a date column that I'm manually populating so that I can have a repeatable test here. But once again, normally you're going to be using either the modified date or the created date here. So the variable that we created above, I'm stuffing the value from my date column into that variable. Now we come down to the compose action, and this is where the action is. And this looks complicated, so let's do this. Let's take everything that I have here. Let's take this entire expression. I'm going to copy it, and let's paste it into Notepad so we can actually see it. And bang. So let's walk through this expression. You see the reference to ticks here. Ticks is an expression, and what a tick is a very, very small unit of time. So any date or time can be converted to a number of ticks. If I'm not mistaken, a tick is a nanosecond. I could be wrong on that, but the takeaway here is that a tick is a very, very, very small unit of time. And this number at the end here is the number of ticks in a day. So what this expression does is this. Notice we're using the SUB expression, so we're subtracting. We are subtracting the number of ticks from UTC now, in other words, the number of ticks that equates to the current date and time. We have that, and from that we are subtracting the number of ticks in that that is represented by the value in that date column that I alluded to before. So I have a date column, we have the current date and time, we want the difference between now and the value in that date column in terms of ticks. So the number of ticks for now, the number of ticks for that the date in the date column, subtract the two. On the outside, notice that we have div, which is a division. So we are taking the difference between the now and the value in that date column and dividing by this number, which represents the number of ticks in a day. The end result will be the number of days that have elapsed since or between these two. So the difference in days between now and the value in that date column. Okay, let's go back to our flow. So let's take another look here. So inside of our loop, we set the variable, and we then we have our compose action, which comes out, does that division and comes out with a number of days. And I said I would explain why I'm using this variable. For some reason, I could not reference the value of that date column inside of this compose action directly. Whatever I did, however I did it, it errored out. However, if I set that value in a variable and then referenced that variable in the compose action, it worked fine. I'm not saying you can't do it. I am saying I couldn't figure it out. And this was the path of least resistance. So I'm setting this variable only so I can use it in this compose action. Up to this point, what we are doing is we're looping through the information on all of the files. For a given file, we want to know the number of days that have elapsed between the current date and time and the date and time in my in the date and time column that I created. Then we come to a condition, and in my case, if the value of that computation, in other words, the number of days is greater than 7, it's more than a week, I want to delete that file, and if it's less than that, I want to do nothing. You can spin this a lot of different ways. You could say you want to move a file, or you want to send an email, etc., etc. You can take whatever action you want. And for that matter, your requirement might be a little different than mine, but I still think that this same basic way of approaching this issue will work well for you. So in summary, what I'm doing is converting the current date and my target date, whatever that might be, to ticks. Finding the difference in ticks, which is a very small measure of time, the difference between those two values in terms of ticks. I am dividing by the number of ticks in a day, which will give me the number of days difference between the two. I am then going and taking action based on that. I'm bumping up against the edge of our 30-minute box, so I'm going to have to wrap it up here. Once again, I tweet a lot on flow topics, so if you want, follow me on Twitter at Scott J. Shearer. And normally at this point, I say that if you have any questions, please send me an email at scott@o365scott.com. However, I'm not going to say that today. And the reason is the Flow community site. That's what we've been talking about for the last half hour. If you have questions on Flow, please post them on the Flow community site. You will be getting the benefit not just of me, but a global community of people that care about Flow. I watch it all the time. It's a good chance I may answer your question anyway. Thank you very much for attending.